Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is David Abdulah, an economist by academic training involved in the search for and development of a popular and relevant pedagogy. He is a labor and political activist in Trinidad and Tobago who is committed to social transformation and justice. Abdulah is a founding member of the political party, the Movement for Social Justice, and he has been its political leader from 2012 to the present. Abdulah spent 39 years at the Oilfields Workers Trade Union, during which he held a number of positions, including the Chief Education and Research Officer, the Executive Treasurer, and General Secretary. He was also the president of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs, and he was the Industrial Relations Advisor to the West Indies Cricket Players Association. He contributed to public information and education through his role as a media commentator, newspaper columnist, and talk show host. I welcome David Abdulah to Savage Minds. I'm very excited to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
Where to begin? I'm going to kick off with the flyer you sent me. So this Sunday evening in Woodford Square on the island of Trinidad, in the nation of Trinidad and Tobago, there will be a vigil for peace. The announcement for this vigil reads as the following. We have all seen the massive machines of war being assembled in the southern Caribbean. This military deployment by the U.S. started just over 2 months ago with a number of destroyers with guided missile capabilities, a nuclear submarine, several amphibious landing crafts, and some 4,000 military personnel. Since then, these very substantial military assets have been increased. B-52 bombers and F-35 jet fighter planes were sent to Puerto Rico, and now the largest naval warship, an aircraft carrier with close to 100 fighter jets on board, and its accompanying flotilla of several destroyers and possibly a submarine was ordered to the southern Caribbean. There will likely be more than 10,000 military personnel located now in our region, end quote. And I'm reading this, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's very beautifully written. It's Pacific, and it talks about the peace that people want and this onslaught of military and military equipment being sent to your region. And I've been following the situation since the beginning. Unsurprisingly, when I posted on Facebook that the U.S. was gearing up for another war, the comments I received were astonishing. You can almost gauge how North American people think, the vast majority, by the comments. One woman said, "What are you talking about? We are praying every day for the U.S. to intervene. How dare you? Venezuela is under a terrorist dictatorship. We are being starved. We have Iran and Hezbollah over there." And she claimed I was spreading disinformation about the U.S. gearing up for war. Another person who's very on the left said, but it doesn't seem to be an invite to war. But anyone who's been watching the media and watching the U.S. over the past 50 years, even 40 years, even since 9/11, can tell that this is a prelude to an invasion. And what is really alarming to me is that the people who are witnessing this in the United States, this is sort of like breakfast as usual for people. They're used to what we do in our country towards the rest of the world as being good because we do it. It's total propaganda that they've internalized. Meanwhile, your flyer, which I'm going to link to underneath the description of the show, people should read because it's such a peaceful and loving evocation of what people are fearing and what they want for their region. So here you are, and I am so happy that you are on the show, David, because this is all the markings of a new colonization, a new regime change. And just yesterday, the Trump administration announced that this is the 16th deadly strike on an alleged drug boat. That's because they hit a 16th boat. And what we are witnessing right now is a rehash of the WMD, weapons of mass destruction, that they used to buttress their narrative for invading Iraq, right? Remember that. And we're seeing that used again. So instead of nuclear weapons, we are being sold in the U.S. and around the world, although most of the world's population sees this for what it is, we are being sold the murder of private civilians from your country, from Venezuela, from other Latin American countries, as eliminating a danger, just like nuclear weapons, but these are drug traffickers, right? So clearly, as someone who has spent a huge chunk of my life in Central and South America, what began several months ago is definitely a prelude to regime change and war. And David, could you talk about the peace vigil and the declaration from August of this year titled A Call to the People of the Caribbean? We must stand firm. The Caribbean must remain a zone of peace. No to U.S. intervention.
Well, yes, thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to be on this program to share information about what is happening and our understanding of what is taking place. So let me begin where you did with our Vigil for Peace, which is on Sunday, the 9th of November. It is taking place in Woodford Square, which is an iconic square in downtown Port of Spain, the capital city of Trinidad and Tobago. It's on the island of Trinidad because we are a twin island state, but it's in downtown, and surrounding Woodford Square on one side is the Parliament building, popularly known as the Red House. On the northern side is the main court, Supreme Court of Justice, Hall of Justice, and the city hall of the Port of Spain City Corporation, and the original first public library, which houses a collection now, because it's not used as a public library, but it houses a collection of the country's first Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams. And on the southern side is the Anglican Episcopalian for Americans Cathedral of Port of Spain, the Holy Trinity Cathedral. So it's an iconic location, and we, over the years, they was used for major political meetings. Dr. Williams, the first Prime Minister before he became Prime Minister, used to use it and call it the University of Woodford Square because he gave public lectures. This was in the 1950s while we were under colonialism and so on. That catapulted him into political leadership in the country. 1970, when we had the February Revolution or the Black Power Revolution, University of Woodford Square was renamed the People's Parliament, since it was right next to the Parliament, where tens of thousands of people would gather to hear speeches by progressive leaders of the day. So we are gathering on Sunday for this Vigil for Peace because as you have described in our statement, there are battleships all around us. I mean, not necessarily in Trinidad and Tobago waters, but very close by in the Southern Caribbean. In fact, there was a U.S. destroyer, the Gravely, that was docked in Trinidad a week ago. And there were a lot of concerns about why that boat was docked in the port of Spain at the time when all of these tensions were taking place with Venezuela and the United States as the U.S. deployed this massive military set of assets to the Southern Caribbean. So people are concerned here in Trinidad and Tobago, in particular because the Prime Minister of this country has taken a position firmly in support of the attacks by the United States on the boats. And so she said, when the first set of people were killed on those boats, she said, kill them all violently, which was a horrible statement. And so she has repeatedly doubled down on her position that this is a war against narco-trafficking. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So there are, however, lots of people in the country who do not wish to have war, who see those attacks on those vessels which killed 2 Trinidad and Tobago nationals in one of the earlier boat strikes as being wrong. And so people want peace, because whenever there is war, in fact, there's a tagline in the flyer, because nobody wins a war. That tagline is actually from a calypso sung by one of our late calypso icons singing Sandra. And that was the tagline in her calypso, because nobody wins a war. So we thought that line would resonate with a lot of people here in Trinidad and Tobago. And that is it's such a true saying, right? The Calypsonian came up with this line because nobody wins a war. And that's true. And so when you see images, as we have seen in the mainstream media and on social media, of Gaza and the genocide of Palestinians, when you see what is happening in Ukraine and so on, in Sudan, in the Congo, elsewhere, wherever there's war, there's a terrible loss of life. Particularly women and children get affected. Families are displaced. You get people fleeing a war zone. Economies get disrupted. Businesses close down. Workers lose their job. People lose their livelihoods. Infrastructure gets damaged, and so we're saying in that situation nobody really wins a war, and therefore Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad is just 7 miles away from Venezuela, so we are just a very short hop across the Gulf of Paria to Venezuela. The Gulf of Paria is a body of water that separates Trinidad from Venezuela, and so if there was war next door in Venezuela of any kind, any attempt at regime change or any destabilization in Venezuela, people will flee that war zone. They will come into Trinidad illegally or otherwise, and that will exacerbate a problem that we already have, because we already have many thousands of Venezuelans who entered Trinidad and Tobago over the last 7 years or so. So that would be a reality. Our fisher folk are being warned not to go far from shore, because they might be the subject of a boat strike or attack of one kind or the other. So they're losing livelihoods. Investors would have problems coming down to invest in Trinidad because it's so close to a war zone. Our shipping lanes, because coming through the Panama Canal, ships have to traverse north of Colombia and Venezuela to get to Trinidad and the Eastern Caribbean. That will be affected. Flights from Trinidad to, say, Panama, those flights cross Colombia and Venezuela. And if you're going south to Suriname or to Guyana, you have to go through Venezuelan airspace. So all of this, creates problems for us. And that is why we are saying no to war, yes for peace, and inviting our people to come out in this vigil for peace. We have had a number of activities outside of the U.S. Embassy, at least 2 of them, which were mainly press conferences where we gathered representatives of different organizations, and so a few individuals came and made statements. But we did it opposite the U.S. Embassy to let the U.S. Embassy know that we are opposing military deployment, we are opposing war, we are opposing regime change. And of course, those statements then got picked up in various media, not only locally but internationally. Some clips went viral and have prompted, requests for interviews such as you're having me on Savage Minds today. So yes, the Assembly of Caribbean People, of which I was a founding member way back in the early 90s, and still a member of the Regional Executive Committee, issued that declaration. We got some 600 people to sign on to that declaration. And not only that, that prompted other letters, open letters. One was initiated by Caribbean feminists, and that got over 110 organizations signing on. So there's been a growing momentum, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but right throughout the Caribbean. Because on the 16th of October, when we were outside the U.S. Embassy as the Assembly of Caribbean People, there were also similar activities, if not outside an embassy, but similar activities, press statements and so on, in many other Caribbean countries. Dominican Republic had a press conference. Jamaica was outside the U.S. Embassy. They issued a joint statement. Grenada, there was activity. Dominica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia issued statements. So there's a growing momentum. We have had, if we pushed, I think, the Assembly of Caribbean People statement pushed CARICOM heads eventually to make a statement on the 18th, 2 days after our regional day of action. They made a statement on the 18th, reaffirming the position that the Caribbean must be a zone of peace, but Trinidad and Tobago did not agree with that. They reserved, quote unquote, their position. And then we had former heads of government of CARICOM issuing a very strong statement a few days after that. And just yesterday, the heads of government of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which is a subset of CARICOM, they issued a very strong statement raising concerns about the military deployment in the Southern Caribbean and reaffirming the position of the Caribbean being a zone of peace. So this is now very much a regional issue. And you're right, if I could just continue one more point, that the so-called war against narco traffickers and so on is a cover just like weapons of mass destruction was a cover for the invasion of Iraq, on a false premise, so too this so-called war against narco traffickers is not really about getting to narco traffickers, because you don't need a aircraft carrier with 100 jet fighters and any number of destroyers and jet fighters and B-52 bombers to take out a few small boats, even though they might have some fast engines on them. You don't need all of that to take them out, right? Those assets are about attacking another country. Guided missiles are not meant to take out a fishing boat with 4 outboard motors on it. Guided missiles are meant to take out military targets. So that's a false narrative. And also, the fact of the matter is, as evidenced by the United Nations Commission on Drugs and Crime, Organized Crime, they issued a report in July, I think it was, of this year, just a few months ago. And the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States also issued a report a few months ago, which both reports stated that the majority of cocaine that is produced out of Colombia goes to the United States via the Pacific coast, not through the Caribbean. And so it goes either through the Colombia's Pacific coast or to Ecuador and then up the Pacific. And so about 87% of cocaine goes that way. Another 8% goes via the Western Caribbean, so that might be through some Central American country and into the US. And only 5% goes east from Colombia into Venezuela, and the Venezuelans might capture maybe about half of that. So about 2.5% of the cocaine will exit Colombia through Venezuela into either Guyana or maybe get into Trinidad and Tobago. So yes, there is a problem for us because whatever quantity comes is not good, but it's not the major drug transit route for cocaine into the United States. And then President Trump said, after one of the boat strikes, a lot of fentanyl was blown up in this boat strike, but fentanyl isn't produced in Colombia. And Venezuela doesn't produce cocaine or processed cocaine either. But fentanyl doesn't come out of South America. It comes out of Mexico and perhaps China. They claim the chemical agents come out of China. But it doesn't come this way. So that just was just a lie, just another one of Trump's lies, and so on. So yes, and the United Nations Human Rights Commission reported just last week that the killing of those people on those boats, some 60 odd persons have now been killed on these boat strikes, is extrajudicial killing. It's a crime. It's illegal. You cannot summarily execute people. You have to capture them by law enforcement, Coast Guard, and so on, and you seize the evidence of whatever they have on board. You take them before a court of law. They're tried, and if they're found guilty, they're sentenced, and they do the time in accordance with the crime they committed. Even in a war between two countries, one country's soldiers can't capture the other soldiers and line them up against a wall and execute them by firing squad. That has been banned. That's illegal under the Geneva Conventions or Treaty of Geneva, the case may be. So those things are killing people with a boat strike like that is wrong. It's extrajudicial killings. And there are people in the United States who have been speaking about that as well. I've heard senators and other persons across the aisle, both Democrats and interesting some Republicans are saying it's wrong. And of course, and commentators and analysts on some of the mainstream media have also said this is extrajudicial killing, and it is wrong.
Yes, this is extrajudicial killing. There's no due process. Obviously, that is an integral part of any democracy. You have due process in Trinidad and Tobago. So do we in the United States. This is outrageous that this is even being tolerated for a minute. This also begs many questions. There's so many questions, such as the disastrous history of the U.S. law enforcement around alleged trafficking. We've seen the devastation this has affected on Colombia. I used to live in Colombia, in Bogota, and I lived there when they were doing the Constituyente after years and years of quasi-civil war over the drug trade. And a lot of this had much to do with the U.S. influence in the region. Who would have thought, when I was living in Colombia in 1990, that Mexico would become even worse? Ironically, I lived in Mexico 6 years later, taught at the university there in Puebla, And I had a colleague who was almost murdered, put into the hospital just a year after I left because the drug war started there heavily towards the late 1990s. And Mexico is unrecognizable to me now. When I read stories about what is going on, anyone who's researched this a little bit knows that the U.S. hand in drug trafficking and policing drug trafficking has devastating consequences for the people of these countries. And I'm sure that frames a lot of the discontent with people not only in your country, but in places like Colombia and Venezuela. Have you talked to people about the harms of U.S. enforcement historically in these areas?
Yes, yes and no. So one of the things that is a reality is that because there is drug trafficking in this region, and there's arms trafficking, and the murder rate in Trinidad and Tobago is unfortunately very high. It's down now this year because there have been successive states of public emergency, which has enabled the police to suppress crime. But when those emergencies end, as they must end at some time, then it might surge again. But in 2024, for example, we had something like 600 people be murdered. Many of them were so-called gang-related. Jamaica's had a similar problem. Jamaica would have had, when we had 600, Jamaica may have had like 1,200 people being murdered. So there is a problem. And those guns come not from Venezuela primarily. There's some that get smuggled across from Venezuela, yes, because let's say Trinidad and Tobago is so close. But the majority of the guns come from the United States. Certainly guns are not going to leave Venezuela and go to Jamaica. Jamaica is very close to the US, and therefore those guns that enter Jamaica come from the United States. As in Haiti, the guns come from the United States. And in Mexico as well. And you remember Mexico actually launched a legal action, and I think some Caribbean countries tried to sign on to it, against gun manufacturers in a court in the US, seeking to have gun manufacturers take steps to prevent the export of guns out of the US into our countries, which in the hands of criminals then result in mayhem and death. So there are agreements between Trinidad and Tobago and all CARICOM countries with the United States and with Britain and with France, because Britain and France still have colonies in the region, and Holland, because there are Dutch colonies in the region as well, with respect to collaboration with matters such as drugs and arms and also human trafficking. And so those agreements are in place, and there are agents of the DA here in Trinidad and Tobago, and the ATF is here as well. And I'm sure they are located in many other Caribbean countries. And there's collaboration with respect to sharing of intelligence. And as a result of that, there's the extradition of people from Trinidad and Tobago to the United States to face charges of exporting drugs into the US. Or importing guns into Trinidad and Tobago. That those things have happened, and there are joint exercises that result in the seizure of drugs, either on land or at sea, and so on. Collaboration between the Coast Guard of the United States and our defense forces. So there's that ongoing collaboration, which is necessary because our countries don't have necessarily all the resources to deal with international, transnational crime. So that is understandable, but that is law enforcement in a proper way, with due process and investigation and intelligence and evidence gathering and arrests and people being brought before the court. And so we support that kind of approach. But it must also be stated, and we have made those points, that the US has no moral authority to speak about a fight against narco trafficking, when under the Reagan administration in the 80s, it engaged in the export of cocaine out of South America to raise money to finance the war against the Nicaraguan government of the Sandinista movement, and also to support in El Salvador the right-wing government against the FSLN. So those wars were extremely bloody and were financed by the drug trade, not only of cocaine but also heroin out of Afghanistan and that kind of thing. And then the US, has created a major problem of substance abuse with the opioid crisis in the US, which were legally produced drugs, which of course people have now substituted for fentanyl and so on. So it really doesn't have any moral authority to tell us about narco trafficking when it was directly involved in narco trafficking, and which has been established by many investigative reports in that whole Iran-Contra war and the trafficking of cocaine out of South America to finance it.
And are there problems in, let's say, your country, Venezuela, Colombia, with these drugs that we know and are well documented, like fentanyl, that are used in excess by Americans due to horrific prescription practices, doctors who've been caught up in PR of big pharma? It's a long story, but I'm sure you know a lot about it. Do you have these kinds of problems in your countries of people basically overdosing while they're in a car park with their children sitting in the back of the car? Because this happens in the States quite a bit.
Yes, and I mean, I've seen media reports about that. No, in Trinidad and Tobago, there is no significant problem at all with respect to opioids or fentanyl or drugs of that kind. There is some about, maybe not fentanyl, but there may be some other kinds of drugs like ecstasy and things like that. But there's no major crisis of opioids or certainly not of fentanyl in Trinidad and Tobago. There would have been, particularly in the 80s and 90s, more particularly the 90s, and there would have been a problem of crack cocaine addiction. Unfortunately, as cocaine would have come transited through Trinidad and Tobago for export elsewhere, and therefore there was some use here, and there would have been crack cocaine use, which was, destroyed quite a number of lives of young people, which was very sad. But there have not been the kind of levels of reporting of crack cocaine use in the recent past compared to, 20 years ago. There is, of course, marijuana use because marijuana is grown here. Marijuana is actually has been decriminalized in Trinidad and Tobago so that persons can grow marijuana plants at their home, but only up to a certain number. You can't have more than, I can't remember what the number is, 3 or 4 plants or something like that. And you could also have in your possession a certain quantity. Again, it's restricted by weight. So if you have more than a certain number of grams, I don't know what that translates into ounces, you could legally have that. You can't use it in public, but you could use it in private. You could smoke it in private. So it's been decriminalized in that way, but it has not been fully legalized. So there's no, no legal cover for people growing large quantities of marijuana plants. But there is marijuana consumption here. And the government that came in recently said they're going to increase the age at which marijuana can legally be used in small quantities from 18 to 25, I think it is. That hasn't yet been changed. That law hasn't yet been changed. We wait to see what comes about. But some people say that, of course, marijuana use at a young age can lead to other kinds of drug use. I'm not an expert in that area, but I'll leave it like that.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. A lot of countries here in Europe are also decriminalizing and have decriminalized marijuana use and are even toying with the idea of production, as per very few. We've been covering so much lately the genocide in Gaza. And this circumstance with Trump and the boats in Venezuela has really been derailed in the media, of course. And the media in the US does its level best to avoid discussing US history of colonization. And our readers and listeners have been hearing a lot about the Monroe Doctrine. Now, it's interesting how You can see it when you're in the streets of London as opposed to the streets of New York. You can see which immigrants are coming from which countries. And certainly, I can easily go a whole day in New York without speaking English. I love it. I love Spanish. I love it. I love all of it. But what's fascinating here is the way that the war on drugs, which started during the Reagan era with Nancy Reagan's Just Say No program, and this whole kind of racialization of drugs as being linked to those people, the Latinos, even though the Reagan administration and the Bush senior administration eschewed the reality that the problem is who's buying these drugs? Who is it supplying for? And they didn't want to address that, even though major American literature at the time was. Bright Lights, Big City, one of many novels that deals with the craziness of the 80s. The problems here that we're facing is that you've got an American populace that doesn't really know its own history. People are aware that there was the war on terror in the Middle East. And many people still, unfortunately, believe that we were fighting evil terrorist groups that weren't being financed by our tax dollars for years. Interstitial narratives that feed into how Al-Qaeda came to be, for instance, over on that side of the world. On this side of the world, you've got the U.S. that has exerted incredible and historical damage throughout all of the Caribbean and Latin America. Here's a partial list of what we do for the world. Cuba, 1898 to 1902, we had a direct military intervention and occupation. 1906 to 1999, 1917 to 1923, U.S. forces seized Cuba from Spain during the Spanish-American War that occupied the country multiple times those years. And the Platt Amendment imposed on the Cuban Constitution gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, thus later establishing Guantanamo Bay, paradoxically, in which we illegally held hundreds of men that were taken from the Middle East, kidnapped, really. And then you have Panama, Colombia. 1903 and 1989, the U.S. supported Panama's independence from Colombia to secure control over the Panama Canal Zone, which later in 1989, the U.S. forces invaded Panama to oust Manuel Noriega, and everyone who's over the age of 35 will remember this. This is insane. So he was what I call our frenemy. He was doing our dirty works until he wouldn't do them, or who knows why, but he became our frenemy. He became our enemy. Nicaragua, horrible story. I used to teach at the University of Managua. I know very well what has gone on in that country, but the U.S. has a love affair in the early 20th century with the Somoza regime. And this went on and on. In fact, there's a famous quote by FDR who said, Somoza's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. The U.S. went on. Nicaragua was seized by the U.S. Marines. They occupied the country from 1912 to 1933, almost continuously for 2 decades, to protect, ostensibly, American businesses in the region and support U.S.-friendly governments, meaning, again, regime change. Haiti, more tragic story. And I've worked in Haiti after the Gudu there in 2010. 1915 to 1934, U.S. Marines occupied Haiti for 19 years, and they controlled the government and finances. The U.S. troops intervened again in 1994. Oh, God, and the whole Papa Doc thing. I'll get very angry in a minute. In order to restore, the U.S. claimed constitutional government. And in 2004, following a coup, again, Dominican Republic, 1916 to 1924. I won't go through it all. Mexico, 1914, and then again in 1916 to 1917. Grenada, everyone can remember who's over the age of 40, 1983, where U.S. forces invaded this island nation, ousting its left-leaning government in an operation codenamed Urgent Fury. And that's not the whole list, because if you go into the CIA organized events, where basically they overthrew the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, which led to a slew of massacres of the indigenous population. There are languages no longer spoken in the Quiche region of Guatemala because of what our country did. Cuba, won't go there. Most Americans should know the story. Brazil, 1964, the U.S. supported a military coup that overthrew the elected president João Goulart, bringing military dictatorship to power. Chile, again, that's their 9/11. People should know about this. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, again, This is very related to the direct U.S. occupations, but instead, this is when the U.S. wink, wink. We're not going to invade you. We're just going to control you by funding the Contras. Remember the drugs for arms deal with Iran, and then supporting this, the Junta Militar in El Salvador and Venezuela, 2002. This is when the previous administrations began to paint Hugo Chavez as an evildoer. Remember, one of my favorite things Hugo Chavez ever did is when he went to speak at the UN, and George Bush had just spoken before him, and he said, huele a azufre. It smells like sulfur. And then in Honduras, 2009, for all our feminists listening who love Hillary Clinton, she's at the helm of this operation where the U.S. supported the coup that removed President Manuel Zelaya from power, resulting in rapes of hundreds of women. But this is just a partial list because there's much more. Now, for our listeners who heard this grocery list of U.S. evildoing, to use a George Bush term, people of your country, people anywhere near the U.S. have good reason to fear what these boats mean. And in the flyer that you sent me about Sunday evening's vigil, I was very alarmed by how many B-2 bombers, fighter jets, and even, of course, the aircraft carrier, how much they're carrying. This is like you said earlier, this is not about drug control. Even if these boats were 100% of them carrying drugs, even if we're going to believe this nonsense about fentanyl that is produced nowhere in the region, even if this were so, you don't need this amount of military power to take out the boats. A drone could do that, right?
That's right. And they are using drones, I think, to strike the boats.
Yes, I think the first two were taken down by drones, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And they call them kinetic strikes. I mean, as if there are no people on board, as if this is not human lives. The first one that was hit, they said it had 11 people on board. Now, 11 people would not be on board a vessel that's transporting drugs. And you just, because assuming you're transporting drugs, you really want to be as light as possible. So the drugs have weight, and then you have extra fuel in containers, to make the round trip, as the case may be. So 11 people on a boat? No, maybe 2, maybe 3 max. And therefore, that might very well have been a boat with other persons that were being transported to Trinidad as part of human trafficking, or just people trying to migrate out of Venezuela for whatever reason into Trinidad. And so I'm sure that there were innocent people who were killed on that boat who would have absolutely nothing to do with any kind of illegal activity. And even if persons were involved in illegal activity, as we made the point before, you don't kill them that way by extrajudicial killings. That's wrong. It's a crime. That's not the way to go. And I'm glad you narrated all of those examples of U.S. military intervention. Of course, you mentioned Dominican Republic in the earlier part of the 20th century, but there was also 1965 when the U.S. went in militarily into Dominican Republic as well. And so yes, we've had these experiences of what used to be called gunboat diplomacy, to the long list of that you narrated, which was excellent information. And people need to be reminded of that all the time. The US also went in Dominican Republic in 1965 militarily. And all of these actions used to be termed gunboat diplomacy. That was a term used, many, many moons ago. But it's totally contrary to UN decisions and, incidentally, of a resolution at the level of the Organization of American States. So that I just try to pull up the quotation so I get it accurately. So in 1978, I think it was, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution stating that there should be zones of peace throughout the world, and obviously the Caribbean would have been one of those. And then further to that, that declaration by the United Nations, the government of Grenada, interestingly, under the leadership of Maurice Bishop, Prime Minister of the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada, made put forward a resolution to the Organization of American States. And of course, you know, the United States is a leading member of the OAS. And that resolution was agreed upon by the OAS in 1979. I'm just going to pick up the actual text because it's important that people know that the United States also signed on to this. Right. So on the 30th of June, 1978, at the 10th Special Assembly of the UN General Assembly, a resolution was adopted which called for and authorized, quote, the establishment of zones of peace in various regions of the world under appropriate conditions to be clearly defined and determined freely by the states concerned in the zone, taking into account the characteristics of the zone and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and in conformity with international law. So that was in June of 78. So further to that now, in October of 1979, at the Organization of American States, which would therefore be the body that is, for this region of the world in accordance with the UN General Assembly resolution, in 1979, Grenada moved the following resolution, and I'm going to quote it. One, to express its deep concern over the heightening of tension in the Caribbean sub-region, resulting from the recent increases in military activity in the Caribbean area. Two, to repudiate the concept of the region or any of its sub-regions as a sphere of influence for any power. Three, to stress its support for the principles of ideological pluralism and peaceful coexistence, which are essential to the peace, stability, and development of the region. Four, to call upon all states to recognize the region as a zone of peace and to devote all their efforts in appropriate regional and international forums to the advancement of this concept, end of quote. So that's a resolution adopted by the Organization of American States that we should be a region of peace. Subsequent to that, the CARICOM community of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, also adopted that position, as did the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States in 2014, I think it was, adopted the position. Yes, January 2014. CELAC adopted the position that this is a zone of peace. And it was unanimously agreed on when CELAC heads met in summit in Havana, Cuba in January of 2014. And in addition to that, from the very start of CARICOM, the Caribbean Community of Nations, which started off with 4 English-speaking Caribbean countries, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana, which are the 4 independent countries at the time in 1973. The idea of a zone of peace, or the Caribbean having to affirm its position for peace, was always part of the philosophy of CARICOM because of our experience as countries that were territories that were conquered by European colonizers, subjected to imperialism, and the wars that were fought over these colonies, which were sources of great wealth for sugar and enslavement and so on. And so the British and the French and the Dutch and the Spanish fought major wars over these colonies and over the control of the wealth that these colonies provided for them, which enabled them to industrialize and develop and so on in the 17th and 18th centuries. So we have had that experience, quite apart from all those that you have mentioned, narrated, and actually Dr. Eric Williams, first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, before we became independent, spoke about the US and the Monroe Doctrine and the shift in the region from Britain to the US as the imperial and colonial power, and that we were seen as locations for conquest militarily, and that we had to bring an end to that. And so from the very early formation of CARICOM as a regional integration process, the idea of a zone of peace being important. So that, for example, some years afterwards, the then Prime Minister of Barbados, Errol Barrow, speaking to the CARICOM heads of government in Guyana, said as follows, and I'm quoting Barrow: "My position remains clear that the Caribbean must be recognized and respected as a zone of peace. I have said, and I repeat, that while I am Prime Minister of Barbados, our territory will not be used to intimidate any of our neighbors, be that neighbor Cuba or the USA. And I do not believe that size is necessarily the only criteria for determining these matters. It is important to let people know where you stand in what is a moral commitment to peace in our region. So this has always been something important to us in the Caribbean. And CARICOM itself adopted this position formally that we are a zone of peace, as did we as part of CELAC and so on, in rejection of that notion of Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary that whatever happens in this region gives the US the right to intervene militarily or otherwise. And so these are important principles.
Yes, and the signatories come from your country, Barbados, Haiti, Martinique, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Suriname, and Dominican Republic, all countries that have throughout their history been directly affected by the slave trade, by indentured servitude, your country especially, because much of your country's population was, I'm sorry to use these terms, but they were brought over from what is today Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh to be workers, a bit better than being a slave. But again, I started to look at the documents into indentured servitude, and it's quite fascinating that one could pay off one's journey in even as short a time as 3 to 6 years. In many respects, some of the contracts I was able to read call into question the kind of conditions that regular humans today are living under, because you certainly could not work 3 to 6 years and pay off your plantation. I read through all the documents you sent me, and I really love how the language is both loving and direct. The language it's used, as you indirectly paraphrased, about the U.S. having no right to speak to your countries about narco trafficking, especially since our country has a historically massive problem with drug use. And as we all know, drug use is not the problem, it's the symptom. There are bigger problems and much related to capitalism. The U.S. is very far away from discussing this, unfortunately. Your country seems much more in touch with the reality of the ills of colonialism, post-colonialism, and this is all linked to capitalism, of course. And then you also, in this document, in the declaration, you talk about people's understanding, I'm just going to read this part, understanding that the end of U.S. imperial hegemony and the failure of the neoliberal capitalist order at the same time as the control of the U.S. state by neo-fascism poses a grave threat to humanity and to peace and the well-being of the majority of the peoples of the world, and especially in the Caribbean, Latin America. I really love this. It just speaks to everything that our country is in denial of. And when we see that more and more people are coming out on the streets saying no to the genocide in Gaza, the powers that be don't know what to deal with this. So you've all noticed, I imagine, in Trinidad and Tobago that they're cracking down on the First Amendment. Now, it's okay to have free speech, but you just can't criticize our BFF, Israel, and you can't criticize their ideology, Zionism, but everything else is fine, just not those two things, right? The world's population has learned some of the positive aspects of our country, of our declaration, which was also very much an influence on the French Revolution, which itself was an influence on much of what happened in Europe for centuries after. Now we have the world's population that is reminding the United States of what it's supposed to be true to, the ideals of democracy that should begin with due process, the understanding that one cannot just bomb boats, vessels in the water outside of their jurisdiction. You can't just say this is international waters, we have a claim here. What do the lawyers in your group say about this? Because there must be certain international laws that are violated. Just because it's international waters does not make it okay, right?
Yes, you're right. There's been no legal action as yet in Trinidad and Tobago. One person has, not part of our group, but a civic-minded individual, has requested under the Freedom of Information law in Trinidad and Tobago information related to what has been happening with the killing of people by those boat strikes and asking the government whether they have information about those strikes and whether there was any communication between the United States and the Trinidad and Tobago government with respect to those actions and so on. I don't know how far that FOI, Freedom of Information request will get, because the government may claim that it's not applicable because there are some aspects of government activity that is excluded from inquiry under the Freedom of Information Act. So we'll see how that goes. The families of the two men who were killed in one of those boat strikes have also begun, I think, certain kinds of actions here. But the problem is that the government that is really responsible is the United States government. And so and then the question arises would be, under which international tribunal would you be able to bring a case against the US government? Because the US has not signed on and therefore not a party to the International Criminal Court. Now, interestingly, the International Criminal Court came about as a result of the lobbying and the initiative of a former prime minister and then later on former president of Trinidad and Tobago, A.N.R. Robinson. He passed away quite some years ago. But Mr. Robinson was the one who, as prime minister and subsequent to him demitting office as prime minister, tirelessly campaigned for the International Criminal Court, which had been mooted, had been spoken about many decades before, but never became reality. But he did put it on the international agenda, which resulted in the Treaty of Rome that brought into existence the ICC. So we have a vested interest in Trinidad and Tobago and in CARICOM for that International Criminal Court, which of course heard the charges brought by South Africa against Israel. And the court has issued warrants actually for the arrest of Netanyahu and others for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So the challenge would be under which international jurisdiction. The other international body is the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. But one doesn't know whether this kind of action could be taken against the United States under the ICJ. But ultimately, I think within the United States, there could very well be action taken by persons within the United States challenging Trump's authority to engage in extrajudicial killings. That might be a matter of interest for civic-minded persons in the US to take up.
And where do you see this going now? Because this has been amped up quite a bit. I do not blame you and your brothers and sisters there activating not only a vigil, the op-ed you wrote in with others. This is all very alarming that the U.S. treats the Caribbean and Latin America like its backyard. And the Monroe Doctrine needs to be rethought, to say the least, no?
It needs to be repudiated. It needs to be ended. I mean, it's 200 years old, right? More than 200 years old, and so it was brought into being at a time when the majority of the Latin America and the Caribbean were not independent nations. And we are independent nations now, and have been for, in some cases, many years. In other cases, more than 200 years. In the case of Haiti, of course, Haiti became independent in 1804. So that's more than 200 years. So it's very important that that doctrine is repudiated and ended. But, the power establishment, the wealthy and those who control the politics of the United States don't want to end that, as they don't want to end the illegal, criminal, illegitimate blockade against Cuba. Just last week, there was the vote in the United Nations General Assembly on the issue of ending the blockade against Cuba. And the vast majority of countries, I think it was 160 odd countries, voted in support of ending the blockade. And the United States and Israel and a few others voted against ending the blockade. And so that blockade should be ended too. That's part of the extension of the Monroe Doctrine. And, there was a important memo, I'm sure you're aware of it, written by one Mr. Lester Mallory in 1960, I think it was, who was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, when he wrote justifying the blockade against Cuba. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm paraphrasing. He said that these measures are necessary essentially to create distress and hunger and deprivation amongst the Cuban people so that they would revolt against the government. Yes, so it was very clear that the blockade was to create a humanitarian crisis in Cuba, creating the conditions where people will be so angry that they would go against the government. Of course, what it did really was to create a sense of greater nationalism amongst the Cuban people to resist any attempt from abroad, namely the United States, to to um, to to end their sovereignty and their independence and their right to self-determination as they wanted and as they saw fit, and to determine their own destiny and their own economic structure and their political systems as is their right. And so that blockade has not succeeded in ending the Cuban Revolution, but it did and continues to cause great distress amongst the Cuban people and has been made worse by the false listing on some so-called list of countries of Cuba on some so-called list of countries that engage in the state sponsorship of terrorism, when Cuba, in fact, was the one that was helping to broker and negotiate peace between armed groups in Colombia like FARC and the ELN and the Colombian government. And those negotiations were taking place in Cuba. So there were representatives of FARC and ELN in Cuba. Not that Cuba was supporting them, but Cuba was trying to mediate peace in Colombia, as you well know. And for that reason, the US says we're sponsoring state sponsor of terrorism, but in fact, Cuba was trying to end conflict and the distress that causes in Colombia. And so Cuba is under great pressure. And one of the things I'm concerned about is the fact that the pressure on Venezuela and the plan for regime change in Venezuela is one route for Marco Rubio to get his wish to try to end the Cuban Revolution. And so we have to understand that military deployment and the aggression against Venezuela, not just in relation to President Maduro, but also in relation to Cuba and ultimately Nicaragua as well. And therefore to reverse any continuing or new developments with respect to left or progressive governments brought into office by social movements primarily, having government and power in countries in Latin America or the Caribbean. So that is their agenda, and it comes back to what you said about US trying to impose its colonial and imperial agenda of hegemony on Latin America and the Caribbean. That is the ultimate objective, and all of these things are parts of that puzzle, if you wish, or part of the strategy of achieving total hegemony. It must be also recognized in the context of the US being challenged by China in terms of economic power of technology, and other kinds of power, because China and the whole notion, therefore, of a multipolar world, not a unipolar world where the United States is the only power in the world and decides what happens everywhere. No, so we are moving towards what some people call a multipolar world. And so you have China with the countries of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and there are other countries that have signed on to BRICS. So you're seeing that kind of shift where people are looking to strengthen economic relations between countries of the global south and trade within the global south rather than relying on US and Western Europe. And China, of course, has invested a lot in Latin America and the Caribbean, not in terms of military bases, not in terms of unfair trading relations that the US has with many of our countries, not imposing unilateral tariffs because you don't like the fact, like Brazil judicial system found Bolsonaro guilty of a crime, and so you want to slap massive tariffs on Brazil. No, China doesn't engage in that kind of bullying and hegemonistic and imperial behavior. China is instead investing in countries, assisting countries with their infrastructure, whether it's ports or whether it's industrial zones and so on. So it's a different kind of relationship, and the US doesn't like that, and therefore is trying to bully its way and control militarily Latin America and the Caribbean to keep China out. but they will fail ultimately.
With the bottom of the vigil call is the first signatory, or it says some of the organizations supporting this initiative include the Concerned Muslims of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, our listeners may or may not know that 5.6% of your population is Muslim. And in fact, your country celebrates a wonderful festival called the Jose Festival, which is a commemoration of the martyrdom of Hussein and Hassan, two grandsons of the Prophet Muhammad, celebrated by the Shiite community. And this is a festival that is unique around the world. I could only imagine hearing news of U.S. warships coming near me, seeing what the U.S. has been doing in Muslim countries over there, might frighten your citizens who are Muslim.
Yes, and of course we have both branches of the Islamic faith here in Trinidad and Tobago, and so we also celebrate as a public holiday. Jose is not a public holiday, but it's a cultural festival, but we do celebrate as a official national public holiday, Eid al-Fitr, which is at the end of the holy month of Ramadan, which is a period of fasting for Muslims. And so, yes, the Concerned Muslims are part of it, of organizing and supporting this activity. This particular group, Concerned Muslims, was instrumental in initiating many demonstrations and marches and protests outside the U.S. Embassy, and marches in different parts of the countries and other rallies against the genocide of Palestinians. I joined them and then involved other civic society organizations, trade union representatives, women's organizations, and others to support those actions that were initiated by the Concerned Muslims about the genocide, and many hundreds of people took part in those protest activities. We haven't had one for quite some time, but they certainly were very active throughout 2023 into 2024.
What do you see happening now? I mean, are there more coalitions being formed around more nations who are concerned? Are some nations just saying nothing, hoping it goes away?
No, I mean, the CARICOM heads, not just in that collective statement they made on the 18th of October, but individual heads of CARICOM have spoken out, in particular, prime ministers of Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Those prime ministers have spoken out quite publicly on these issues, as well as the statement that was issued just yesterday by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which comprises St. Kitts and Nevis, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, St. Lucia. I'm missing one or two, I think. But so those governments under the OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, all of which, of course, are also part of CARICOM, but the OECS has a separate structure of collaboration and cooperation. They issued a very strong statement on this matter as well. So, yes, CARICOM governments have been speaking out, have been raising issues of concern. Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, has a different position. They have taken a position pro Washington, which is very unfortunate, but people in Trinidad and Tobago, there are some who support the government, obviously, because that's their political party in office, but there are many others who do not support the government's position, and therefore, that is why we have appealed for this vigil, for people to come out for this vigil for peace on Sunday afternoon.